I want to make a series of videos about a book by François Laruelle, a biography of the ordinary man, which was translated into English only recently in 2018, and I think it was translated at the right time in a certain sense. It came out in French in 1985, and it's acquired a new contemporaneity in relation to various types of philosophical work and projects that have come up recently. So I don't know really how to introduce the book or to present it, so maybe I'll let the book present itself or suggest how to present it. So it's called A Biography of Ordinary Man on Authorities and Minorities, and in French, in Biography de l'homme ordinaire, des autorités et des minorités. This book came out in 1985. The immediately preceding book came out in 1981. This one's not translated yet. Le principe de minorité, the minority principle, or the principle of minority. And according to Laruelle, in the biography of Ordinary Man, BOOM, if we take the acronym, the principle of minority represented a breakthrough. You could almost call it a conversion. So I think A Biography of the Ordinary Man is very methodologically and epistemologically sophisticated, and he's constantly making methodological remarks. So we would do well to listen to his methodological and epistemological remarks and contexts and methodical suggestions. So I'll just read to you from inside. This is non-standard philosophy. It's one of his major works, one of the most important, and it has not been translated yet. Maybe I'll be able to talk a little about the order of translation into English. So just looking inside there, this is not up to date because he's gone on to write stuff after this. He divides his philosophical evolution into phases or waves, philosophy 1, philosophy 2, and so on. It's quite interesting that he calls it philosophy 1. These are waves of philosophy, even if in wave 2 or philosophy 2 he calls the discipline that he is working in and inventing at the same time non-philosophy. In his terminology of waves, they're all waves of philosophy. So I want to be reading his work to try and come to an understanding of it, and also to use it to philosophize at the same time, as far as possible, for me and for you who are reading the book maybe and listening to these videos. So philosophy 1 begins in 1971. None of that has been translated, so I'll just translate the titles. Phenomenon and Difference, an essay on Ravesson, 1971. Textual Machines, Deconstruction and the Libido of Writing, 1976. So already from these two titles you can get an idea of the problematic that he was working within in the 70s. Basically, he was operating a synthesis of Deleuze and Derrida, the most radical thoughts of his time, and pushing them further. And that's a constant of his work, not so much the synthesis as that each book is a laboratory experience and a laboratory experiment. We're inside his laboratory and he's pushing his thought as far as possible, and so it's uncompromising, it's intransigent. Sometimes it can seem really difficult to read, and as if he's not really making any concessions to the reader, but he's not making concessions to himself either. And in fact, most or all of these books are based on a form of dialogue with the times, with the past, and with the future as well, and with himself. So they're not as isolated or solipsistic as they may seem. So continuing, we said phenomenon and difference in 71, textual machines, deconstruction, and the libido of writing in 1976, Nietzsche contra Heidegger, or Nietzsche versus Heidegger in 1977, the decline of writing in 1977, and then Beyond the Power Principle in 1978. Then there was a pause of 3 years, and a new wave begins. And the first book, The Minority Principle, comes as a sort of response in the title to the programmatic Beyond the Power Principle of the previous book. And what is beyond the power principle? It's the principle of minority. So in the whatever it's called in English, in the avant-propos, in the foreword to Biography of Ordinary Man, Laruelle says that this first book, in the second wave, the principle of minority, constituted a breakthrough. And yet at the same time, the real content of the breakthrough is presented in a Biography of Ordinary Man, which was published 4 years later. So I think that's a typical experience or trait of revolutionary thought within the sciences and within the arts and within maybe other things as well, like politics and human relations. The breakthrough, in a sense, is all at once. You're in a new world, and that's the transcendental part of the breakthrough. And in a more empirical sense, it takes time. You don't get everything, all the parts and details and connections between them all at once. You have to work through the breakthrough, which is an ongoing thing. So it comes in two strikes or two blows, and the first part of the breakthrough is the minority principle, but he will say that the minority principle is a transitional work. So in the foreword, he says at the beginning of the second paragraph, From this point of view, this essay, unlike the Minority Principle by the same author, finally unfolds in the rigorous order required by the transcendental science of individuals as such. So what he's doing, and he'll make this clear and go over and over the idea again and again, is he's proposing in this book, A Biography of Ordinary Man, a transcendental science of individuals or of humans or of the ordinary man or of minorities. That's a set of synonyms or quasi-synonyms for him. The Minority Principle is a transitional book, a mixed attempt in the spirit of traditional philosophy. In my text it says in the spirit. There's missing an I, so there's a misprint there. In the spirit of traditional philosophy, to break with that philosophy, and in particular with the author's earlier books. That book was a breakthrough, in the scare quotes, that still proceeded pedagogically and philosophically, that is to say, by means of transcendence. Studying from philosophical problematics, Kant, Husserl, Nietzsche, contemporary thinkers, with capital letters for contemporary thinkers. So mainly he's thinking of Deleuze and Derrida, but there are allusions in this book to the différent with a D, so to Lyotard, who published the différent 2 years earlier, I think, in 1983, and also to Foucault, and probably to many others. Anyhow, the Principle of Minority is a transitional book, and once you sort of get the general idea of what Laruelle wants to talk about, you can see why, in the very aspect of the title, he's going from beyond the power principle to the principle of minority, to be this new science based on immanence and based on the absolute, and breaking outside of all philosophical canons of confinement, and at the same time he's calling it a principle. So in A Biography of Ordinary Man, he will talk about the idea of principle, and he'll tell us that we have to get away, that the real operation is removing the logical status of a principle and getting back to the real, which is individuals. So from his 1985 point of view, the minority principle, in one sense, it just doesn't go far enough, and in another sense, if you give a minority the full-powered sense that he gives the term in A Biography of Ordinary Man, we've got a contradiction between the two terms of the title, minority and principle. Minority is the basis for a rigorous science, so there's rigor in it, but one that does not function by principles in a philosophical sense of principles. So there we get the beginning of an explanation for the title, A Biography of Ordinary Man, which, compared to the titles of his previous books, looks different, even if it has the subtitle of Authorities and Minorities, or I would like to say of Authorities and of Minorities. because there are two ways of reading the subtitle. We've got, in sort of ordinary language, a biography of ordinary man, our title, whereas in the preceding books they're all in philosophical and contemporary jargon. So a biography of ordinary man looks like a break from transcendent philosophy towards something more immanent that he wants to call ordinary, but despite using familiar terms, he's giving them a different sense than the ordinary sense. One could say that for Laruelle, everything in philosophy is interpreted and to be interpreted by us in terms of transcendence. Everything in this book, every term, is to be interpreted in terms of immanence. And not only in terms of immanence, but in terms of the transcendental as condition of immanent experience. So biography is meant as a conceptual biography. He tells us that he's not going to give examples or talk about cases, and in the last part of the forward, he says that there is the deliberate omission of all citations. So he's not giving examples or cases. He says a little later on that it's deliberate. He's not giving any quotations, although he'll say all sorts of things about philosophy and contemporary philosophy, but he doesn't give citations. Or putatively idle discussions. So this is a problem with translations and the fact that you can't translate 100% of the nuances into English, but I feel uncomfortable with putatively idle discussions. In French, it's l'absence voulue de toute citation ou discussion supposée oisive. So, idle discussion, that seems okay to me. The problem for me is supposé. It's not supposément. If you say supposément or putatively, it's the others who suppose that the discussions that I want to eliminate, or that Laruelle wants to eliminate, are idle. If we stick to the text, it should be clear from the fact that it's supposé that it's that Laruelle wants to avoid discussions that he considers to be idle talk, and that's true. The book is quite, if not arduous, it's quite almost ascetic. It doesn't deign to give the sort of theatrical, dramatical, colourful sorts of illustrations, examples, or accompaniment that many other philosophy textbooks or works of creation give. So it's a biography, but it's a conceptual biography or a transcendental biography of the ordinary man. So what is the ordinary man? It's not the average or the everyday man. We do have a principle, not a principle, we have an objection. He uses the word man. The translators have tried, when possible, to get away from the patriarchal connotations of man and transpose it into the human or into people. So the introduction comes after the forward. The title of the first section is Des sciences de l'homme à la science des hommes, from the sciences of man to the science of men. The translators, so the words coincide on the two sides of the two. The translators have translated that from the sciences of man to the science of people. It's, I suppose, in terms of content, correct. In terms of style, we lose something. Anyhow, on this page, which is page 1, he tells us what he means by the terms in the title. So, ordinary man is the finite individual whom we also call minorities. And he or she, or they are located in this indifference, which he's been talking about, tolerant indifference to philosophy. So, ordinary man, or the ordinary human, is located in this indifference, which they draw from themselves rather than from philosophy. That's at the top. Then at the bottom of the page, we have, the book is composed of theorems, and they're numbered, and we're meant to read them in the order that they're numbered. So that all sounds very rigorous and authoritative. But in the introduction, he presents 5 human theorems that are not numbered in the numbering system of the theorems of the book, but they are numbered from 1 to 5, and then he just starts again in the body of the book. So, number 5, he says, a rigorous science of ordinary man, that is, of man, is possible. A biography of the individual as minorities and as authorities. A theoretically justified description of the life he leads between these two poles, which are sufficient to define him. So, the title, A Biography of Ordinary Man, already contains, once you understand it correctly, an allusion to the theoretical terms of the subtitle. Biography, especially of an ordinary man, is the rigorous description of the experience of ordinary man between the two poles of authorities and minorities. A second quotation from later on page 10, Laruelle says, this is the meaning of this, in inverted commas, biography of ordinary man. A rigorous description of the most general experiences that govern the relation of individuals as such to history, to the state, to economy, to language. So the biography is a rigorous description of the general experiences that describe the relations of man, that is to say minorities, 2, was page 10, to history, to the state, to economy, to language, the authorities. Another term he'll use, at least for some of the authorities, is the human sciences. So the relations of individuals to history, politics, economy, economics, and linguistics are what he's trying to get out of. So he's going to talk about the general experiences, that is to say, not included in the authorities, that govern the relations between the individuals or the minorities and the authorities. So even though he's not giving examples in the ordinary sense, he is talking about experience and experiences, but they're transcendental experiences. So these experiences are present in our ordinary experiences, but there's something transcendental, that is to say, of immanent conditions that are within, pervading, and constituting the experiences or their possibility or their reality. So that's why he says his new science is not an empirical science. I'll read again from the foreword. This book attempts a systematic foundation for a discipline that has, needless to say, already been signalled and hinted at in the history of thought, a rigorous science of man, but one different. This is its interest and its risk from both philosophy and the sciences of man, which derive from it. So he says the sciences of man, sometimes he says the human sciences. When he says it, he doesn't usually give examples of what he means, but then in other places he says it's history, politics, economics, linguistics, and so on, which means it includes psychology and sociology and ethnology, and probably lots more. I have a reservation already about the English translation, so I'll read my own translation. I'll retranslate. This work is an attempt at a systematic foundation of a discipline which has obviously sketches and promises or promissory notes in the history of thought. They talk about being signalled and hinted at. So I think it's more than that. He's really sort of giving a Nietzschean tone that hasn't been signalled and hinted at. It has really existed in the form of philosophy and maybe in the 19th century of psychology, but these philosophies and their derivatives, even when they take systematic form, have only been sketches and promises, sort of like unfulfilled manifestos, long-winded unfulfilled manifestos, if it's a long systematic work. And now he's coming, that's at the best, and now he's coming along with the real thing. He tried to do it with the minority principle, but he admits he was still encrusted with philosophical and transcendent principles. Because we're seeing, or I'm seeing, a Nietzschean note, I would like to go back to the passage I read about the book Minority Principle being a work of transition. In the English translation, it says, what does it say? That the book was a breakthrough that still proceeded pedagogically and philosophically, that is to say, by means of transcendence. So that's a good translation, but in French it says that it still proceeded pedagogically and philosophically, that is to say, along the paths of transcendence, voie de la transcendance. Voie, you can deconcretize it and say ways and means, but it's also a little more concrete and means paths. And because we're talking about Nietzsche, who crops up all through the forward at least, in terms of alluded to presence, it's good to keep in mind this idea that we're talking about paths, and then the first sentence of the book. This book attempts a systematic foundation. In more literal translation, this book is an attempt. So it's interesting because I would say that we have already in the vocabulary a sort of double synthesis. Well, a synthesis is double anyhow. Between a Nietzschean note, all this idea of attempts and of paths, and we'll go on to see in terms of affects, and a Spinozist influence in terms of rigor, science, theorems. Although, oddly enough, the book is composed of theorems, and each theorem is followed by a long passage before the next theorem, and the long passage is not a proof but a commentary and an explanation. So even the Spinoza influence is Nietzscheanized. I think I've said all that I want to about the title for the moment. So we have to keep in mind this idea that everything that we're reading has to be seen as perhaps using ordinary language or ordinary philosophical language, and it is susceptible of two different readings: a transcendent reading, which we will be instinctively, automatically, impulsively liable to give to the terms, and an immanent or transcendental immanent reading that we have to work at, and in principle read the whole book in a timeless instant and apply to all the terms of the book. So that brings up, once again, we see it in the title, and we see it in the theme of the first paragraph of the foreword. What language must we use when we effect conceptual revolution? So there are sort of two main options. One is we've got really different concepts, so we invent a new language. And that's something that Laruelle will be doing in this book, and even more so in later books. He'll be composing terms, juxtaposing terms, agglutinating terms in new ways to create new expressions, because he will consider that there's no ordinary way to say what he's trying to say. The other strategy, which he employs quite a lot, especially in this book, is using ordinary language in an extended sense of ordinary, where philosophical language can be counted as ordinary, and giving new senses, new meanings, new conceptual content, and syntactical connections to. So why not say a biography of ordinary man, and mean something arduous that you can only come to slowly, as the sense of those words. So he says that it's a sort of manual or compendium. I'm back in the forward in the first paragraph, of arguments for this new discipline. So then you're getting, once again, the sort of authority side of things. All this is a rigorous science. It's full of arguments. It's a manual, as if everything was already decided and worked out, and it's a manual of instruction. And at the same time, he says, well, I'll continue first. It can be read in two ways, either following only the series of its theorems, or following also the explications or the commentaries that accompany them. So that raises another problem. In what order should you read a philosophical text? And that's not as easy a question as it seems. He gives us instructions. I want to call it advice, as he's constantly giving us advice in his text. But the advice is, read everything in order, in the order of the theorems, or in the order of the explications or the commentaries that accompany them. So either way, its reading should be linear and follow the order of the parts, as well as the order of the theorems in each part. So that's pretty confining, and I've already violated his instructions in this video, because I've given you quotations from later on in the book, and that's explicitly, and implicitly I've used my knowledge of the rest of the book and of the rest of his work. So am I really violating his instructions? The prescription, read in the order of the theorems, looks like it's a pretty chronological order. Chronological in the sense of following the pages of the text. At the same time, chronology is an empirical concept, and he's going for the transcendental, not exactly correlates, the transcendental versions of all the concepts that crop up in the book. So I would argue or here, this is the anti-rhizome instruction par excellence. You can't jump all over the place like in rhizome. That's bad methodology for him. You have to read everything in order. But at the same time, to read everything in order transcendentally, you may be obliged to cross-reference, jump further ahead, jump back, especially as we're reading this book 36 years after it was published, and we're not totally blank slates in terms of Laruelle's ideas, and in terms of people who may, even without knowing anything about Laruelle, who have come after him and may have propounded similar ideas to his. So this sort of authoritative order that he sets up may be less structural and sort of like a structural policing than it looks. So anyhow, he sort of gives a justification for why we have to read it in this order, but already he's contradicting himself. So we're meant to read it in the order given, and then he says we could not avoid certain preemptions intended to give a view of the whole. Preemptions, in French the word is anticipation, so anticipations. They're sort of glimpses, sort of signals and hints. Only he's doing it, so it's good. And when other philosophers did it, it was bad. And besides, they didn't have the full system that he's got. So it has to be linear, but he admits he couldn't avoid giving us preemptions, and also he had to demonstrate, as it is said nowadays, the stakes of the project. So these stakes are very much like the program, the promises that I evoked before. Remember I said that the old philosophy before Laruelle came along with his new science, the old philosophy at best was sketches and promises. And now he's saying that the book is very systematic, very rigorous, but it has sketches or anticipations and promises or discussions of the stakes, or as an integral part of it, that we could not avoid, it's unavoidable. So in fact, the right order includes this sort of glimpses and announcements within it, whereas the bad order is just glimpses and announcements and nothing else. So we could not avoid the preemptions and the stakes, but they do not undermine the necessary order of experiences described here as those of the life of every man. So I think I'll leave it here for the moment. We've got what have we got? We've got something that sounds very modest, yet is very ambitious at the same time, and underlying all that, we've got a process of revising and revisioning what the philosophical activity is. He's trying, in fact, to convert our gaze. He'll say it later in the second paragraph, but in fact he's trying to convert our gaze, our process of thinking from transcendence to immanence, and nothing will be untouched. So even the idea of system and of linear order will not exit untouched from that sort of conversion experience. So it's a paradigm change. It's or gestalt switch or leap into an incommensurable framework that he will present as both wider and more rigorous, in a sense that he'll define later on, giving a first definition in the foreword. So we're being invited to an experience of rigor, a transcendental experience of rigor, and not to an empirical experience of rigor. So in fact, for the moment, we don't really know what we're getting into. He's putting on sort of the airs of authority to reassure us that he knows what he's doing and he's taking us somewhere, and at the same time he's making us feel less assured, because the sense of these words, including the words of assurance, the words of philosophical authority, are being slightly, or for the moment slightly, skewed in relation to their ordinary meanings.